R53 Mini, you know that one of its main issues is that the strut towers will deform with time because the suspension is so stiff. So while this one isn't too bad, the one on the passenger side is actually pretty bad. It's called mushrooming, where this metal cannot stay flat and it will deform upwards as it absorbs all the energy from the rough roads it's been driving over. So one of the ways to protect against that is to get strut tower defenders. And there's a lot of different companies that make them a lot of different ways, but the one that I personally think is the best, and this is completely independent of the fact that they do sponsor me, is I think ECS Tuning's solution is the best for a couple of reasons. Number one, it looks great. So it's this nice anodized aluminum. It's got a black coating on it, or you can get it in bare aluminum. I think you can also get it in red. And what it does is this little notch here fits on these little ridges on top of the strut tower, and it's going to fit perfectly on the top of the strut tower, and it's going to support it from the top side. This is good for a couple reasons. Number one, if you're adding steel underneath the strut tower, that's going to lift the car up off of the strut, and it's going to artificially raise the height of your car, so you're going to have a larger gap. I also like that it uses this little specially designed replacement nut that will sit on top of the strut tower defender and replace this nut right here. So all you're going to see is the top of this nut right here, but it will still thread into the factory strut and hold everything in place. So the aluminum is going to be lighter than the steel, but because there's so much thickness, it's still going to be strong, and it's not going to be underneath this lifting the car up. Plus, because it's aluminum, it'll never rust, you're never going to have an issue with it, and it's a lot easier to install because if you do not have any mushrooming, literally all you have to do to install it is undo these 3 nuts, put this on there, and install the 3 replacement nuts. That is it. Because I have some mushrooming, we are going to have to undo both sides, let the strut hang down, and massage this a little bit with a sledgehammer and some wood just to keep from mauling up all of the finish. But really, even if your car does have some mushrooming, this is something you should be able to knock out in about 30 minutes or less. And if your car has no mushrooming, you can knock it out with 5 minutes with the car on the ground. You don't even have to jack it up. So we're going to go ahead and undo all 3 nuts on both sides to let the suspension hang down. We're going to hammer this out, make it nice and flat, and then we'll put on our ECS Tuning Strut Tower Defender, and we'll be done. So I've got all the suspension out of the way, so we've undone the 3 nuts on either side, and we've let the strut drop down. Because it's attached to the wheel and it's McPherson strut, it's going to be really heavy, so just be careful, make sure you don't have any body parts in the way when you finally drop that down. You can also put a jack underneath it and lower it slowly. That's never a bad idea. So now that I've got this out, it's nice and exposed. I've got a nice thick piece of wood here, and I'm just gonna line it up here and just hit it with the hammer. Don't overwork it, go slow, do 1 or 2 hits and check your work. So once you're happy with the fitment, put this on here, check, make sure you have as little clearance as possible between the strut tower and the defender as you can possibly get, and then you can start to raise the strut back into place with a jack. Now, depending on how deformed your strut tower was, the 3 points that were straight up originally in the strut may have spread out, and you may have to take the strut off to rework it. So just be aware that you may have to take the strut out if you want to fix all of that deformity and get it to slide back up properly. If you're replacing your struts, this would be a great thing to do with that, so if you have fresh struts, you have a fresh start with that issue. So I'm going to try and raise it up, and hopefully everything is still straight up and down enough that it'll slide right into place. Here's the strut out of the passenger side of my car, and looking at the top hat here, you can see just how important this modification is to prevent the mushrooming on the car. So this is mostly flat, and then we go to this side, which takes a really steep downturn, and you can see how these are at very different angles. They're supposed to be up straight and they're out really wide, and that is not what you want. So this is salvageable, it's just metal, so I can just hammer it gently back into place. But this shows you just how bad it can get if this is neglected over time. And because this car is 13 years old, it's had plenty of time to drive on the roads, and deform that metal on the strut tower. So these defenders are a very, very important but cheap modification to your car. As you might be able to tell by the water all over the engine bay, halfway through installing this, it started to dump outside. It was just a freak summer thunderstorm that rolled through. And since I was halfway through getting the strut off, I was forced to just continue what I was doing. I couldn't move it into the garage. But as you saw how bent the top hat was, it was definitely worth taking the strut out. I got everything lined up. It was still really difficult to get this on here because there's a little collar that goes down off of this nut that has to fit into a hole in the defender. It was really difficult to get all those to line up because they still weren't perfectly straight up. They were still out just a little bit. So get it as flat as you possibly can and make sure you just barely start each one and work it down almost like you're tightening up your wheel to nice and evenly flatten it out. One other install tip is use the old factory nuts and not these when you're pulling the strut back in. So if you have to take it out and you're trying to get it pulled back up in the car and you're trying to get all the holes to line up, go ahead and use those old nuts on the back to tighten it up, and you can move the jack out of the way and start working the studs back up. And then once it is held in place, you can put the jack back under, support it with the jack, and then you can switch over to your tower defender. And then of course keep those nuts in case A, you want to remove these for some reason, or B, they're just good factory quality nuts with a nice little flange on them and you can use them for other projects. One thing I would definitely recommend is after you torque this down, which I torqued mine down to 30 foot-pounds, check this after about a week of driving, even sooner than that. Just periodically check it over the first couple weeks to make sure these stay tight as this strut tower kind of molds back around this defender. So as these two seat and settle into what their final shape is going to be, just keep checking these to make sure they stay nice and tight and you don't have any sort of issue with one of these nuts backing off. I bet you could order one from ECS Tuning, but I wouldn't want to lose one because you cannot replace it by just going down to the hardware store. So you're going to have to wait on one of these to come in the mail, or you're going to have a strut that's only held down to two places. So make sure these are nice and tightly torqued. I would even recommend using some thread locker if you have it. Other than that, the install was pretty straightforward. It's only going to be a problem if you have the mushrooming. If you don't have it and it's perfectly flat, you can install this in 10 minutes. If you have really bad mushrooming like I did, you're going to have to take the strut out, get all that out of the way, get it straightened back up, get it back in, get everything lined up, and then you can torque it down. I'm really, really happy with the quality of these. It fits perfectly over this little notch here. It's a very quality piece. The aluminum looks nice, and with it being black and out of the way, you don't even really notice it's there, so you still have a stock look. I've got a link to these down in the description, so if you want to get these same exact one for your car, there's a link down there. If you have any questions, of course, drop them in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys next week.